In the early hours of June 22, 1941, over 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, and nearly 4,000 aircraft launched an all-out assault on the Soviet Union in what would become the largest military operation in history, Operation Barbarossa. It was Hitler's ambitious gamble to crush the Soviet Union and establish German dominance over Europe. But how did it unfold, and why did it ultimately fail? Let's dive into the incredible story of Operation Barbarossa and its disastrous consequences for Nazi Germany. Hitler had always been obsessed with the idea of Lebensraum, living space for the Aryan race. He viewed the Soviet Union as a key to this vision. The signing of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact in 1939 had only been a temporary measure for Hitler, allowing him to secure his Western Front before turning eastward. By 1940, after the fall of France, Hitler believed the time was ripe for his invasion of the Soviet Union. The Nazi leadership underestimated the Soviet military and saw it as a rotten structure that would collapse under the weight of a swift German assault. Hitler was confident that Operation Barbarossa would bring the Soviet Union to its knees within weeks. Operation Barbarossa was meticulously planned. It was divided into 3 major thrusts. Army Group North aimed to capture Leningrad. Army Group Center was tasked with advancing on Moscow. Army Group South would take control of Ukraine and the vital oil fields of the Caucasus. The scale of the operation was unprecedented, covering a 1,800-mile front from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The Wehrmacht planned for a rapid blitzkrieg-style invasion, hoping to replicate the quick victories they had achieved in Western Europe. On June 22, 1941, the attack began with the Luftwaffe conducting devastating air raids, destroying hundreds of Soviet aircraft on the ground. In the initial days, the German forces smashed through Soviet defenses with surprising ease. The Soviet army was caught off guard, still reeling from Stalin's purges, which had left its military leadership decimated and its forces unprepared for such a massive assault. German panzers cut through Soviet defenses like a knife through butter. By July, they had encircled hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops in massive pockets, capturing or killing over 1 million soldiers. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad, while Army Group Center made rapid gains toward Moscow. But beneath the surface of these early successes, cracks in the German plan were already beginning to show. Stalin, initially paralyzed by shock, soon rallied the Soviet war machine. He called for a great patriotic war, and the Soviet people responded with fierce resistance. Soviet forces, though suffering catastrophic losses, continued to fight back, delaying the German advance in key areas like Kiev and Smolensk. As the Germans advanced, Soviet forces employed a brutal scorched earth policy, destroying anything of value before the Germans could capture it. Crops were burned, factories were dismantled, and vital infrastructure was destroyed. This policy denied the Germans much-needed resources, such as food and fuel, as they pressed deeper into Soviet territory. Despite their initial victories, the further the German army pushed into the Soviet Union, the more stretched their supply lines became. Hitler had underestimated the sheer vastness of the Soviet Union and the resilience of its people. The Germans soon faced severe shortages of fuel, food, and ammunition, which would later contribute to the faltering of their advance. By October 1941, German forces had reached the outskirts of Moscow. The fall of the Soviet capital seemed imminent, but winter was approaching fast. Hitler had not prepared his troops for a winter campaign, believing the Soviet Union would have collapsed by now. Soviet forces launched desperate counterattacks, slowing the German advance. When winter finally set in, the German troops found themselves poorly equipped to deal with the freezing temperatures. Their vehicles froze, weapons malfunctioned, and soldiers suffered frostbite in the sub-zero conditions. Meanwhile, the Soviets were better adapted to the harsh winter and brought in fresh reserves from Siberia, who were trained to fight in such conditions. The Germans launched a final offensive toward Moscow, known as Operation Typhoon, but it was too little, too late. In December 1941, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov launched a massive counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back from the gates of Moscow. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht was shattered. The failure to capture Moscow marked the turning point of Operation Barbarossa. What was supposed to be a quick and decisive victory turned into a prolonged, grinding war of attrition that Germany could not sustain. The Soviet Union had not only survived but had begun to mobilize its vast resources for a counteroffensive. One of Hitler's greatest mistakes during Barbarossa was his decision-making. He constantly interfered with his generals, shifting the objectives of the army groups and wasting valuable time and resources. Instead of focusing on Moscow, he diverted forces to Leningrad and the Ukrainian front, weakening the overall offensive. By 1942, it became clear that the Germans had overreached. Operation Barbarossa had failed, and the Eastern Front would become a massive drain on German resources for the rest of the war. The scale of death and destruction during Operation Barbarossa was staggering. It remains one of the bloodiest military campaigns in history. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians were killed, with entire cities destroyed in the wake of the German advance. German casualties also mounted as the war dragged on. Operation Barbarossa was not just a military campaign, it was also the opening act for the Holocaust in the East. The Nazis implemented their General Plan Ost, which aimed to depopulate and Germanize vast areas of the Soviet Union. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed behind the Wehrmacht, carrying out mass shootings of Jews, communists, and other undesirables. Operation Barbarossa was a colossal failure for Nazi Germany and the turning point of World War II. It shattered the illusion of German invincibility and set the stage for the brutal Eastern Front, where the Soviet Union would eventually turn the tide and march all the way to Berlin. Hitler's overconfidence and underestimation of the Soviet Union led to one of the most disastrous military campaigns in history. Operation Barbarossa not only failed to achieve its objectives, but also sealed Germany's fate in the war. As we look back on this historic campaign, we see how the hubris of a dictator and the resilience of a people shaped the course of history. If you're fascinated by these turning points in history, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the pivotal moments that changed the world.